Raise your hands if your job is something that could be described as a tech leader. Okay. Now, hands back up. Keep your hands raised if at some point in your earlier career you were a developer or a coder or a software engineer or someone working with hands-on with technology. Okay, now you can put your hands down. Basically, everybody who had their hands up, you've got where you are today by being successful with technology. Well done. Congratulations. But if you had to describe what you actually do today, imagine yourself, you're in a very, very fast elevator and you have to give someone an elevator pitch between 2 floors about what you actually do. You would probably end up saying something like, I get people to do things. That's pretty much what you do. You get people to do things. And the thing about getting people to do things is that when you are working in the world of code, it's really easy. It's garbage in, garbage out. Everything has rules. It's red, green, refactor. If you don't understand how an API works, go and look it up in the documentation. You might be lucky and there is some. But when you start working with this is a human brain. It's about 1.5 kilos. It has the consistency of the custard that you get in a pudding pretzel, apparently. I've never actually kind of opened somebody's head and played with it, but that's what I'm told. It's probably the most complicated biological structure that we know of on the planet, and therefore by extension it's also the most complex biological structure we know of in the universe. And we know how it works on a biochemical level. We know how the neurons fire, we know what neurotransmitters are, we understand the biochemistry of it all. But when we come to human behavior is completely non-linear. People do not behave like algorithms. You don't get garbage in, garbage out with people. You get sense in and garbage out. Sometimes you put garbage in and you get sense out. Sometimes you put something in and you get nothing out. But people don't work like machines, which is a bit of a problem for you because your success so far has been based on your ability to work with machines. So you've basically got 2 choices. You can kind of figure it out unconsciously, just fuck things up, do them again, fuck them up again, try and get it right. Or you can try and figure things out a little bit more consciously. And that is where power and politics come in. These are 2 aspects of non-linear human behavior that you have to understand when you're in a position as a tech leader. That's me. Why am I talking to you? Why should you listen to me? Well, I did the math a couple of weeks ago, and I realized that I've been doing this very nearly 25 years, which is a super scary thing to do because it makes you feel very, very old. Originally, I was an electrical engineer, which is kind of that's its purest form of systems and algorithms and equations. Things are completely physical. Fell into software development, and I've been fucking things up for 25 years, repeatedly, time and time again. But midway through that process, I took a couple of years out and I did an MBA. Normally at this point, people start throwing things because engineers don't like MBAs for good reason. But one of the things you do on an MBA is you study organizational psychology, which is basically human psychology in the organization, and it's fascinating. And some of the things you learn are that actually people might not be completely linear, but you can start to apply patterns and frameworks. So, what I want to show you tonight is a couple of frameworks that you can use to understand power and politics in your organization, hopefully not fuck things up. So let's start with power. What do we mean by power? What do people think of when we talk about power? It probably looks something like this. Big shouty bloke with a hat on, telling you to drop and give him 20. That's power. You have rank, you wear a badge, you carry a big stick. Or it might look something like this. You're born to it. You're superior to me. Your power is absolute. Off with his head. Or it might look like this. Elected power. Now, this is Donald Trump, in case you were wondering. Yeah. He's the leader of the free world. I'm beginning to think the dictatorship have something to say for themselves. But he leads a country of 327 million people, a $20 trillion economy, and according to Global Firepower, which is kind of like a ratings agency for military forces, it's a fantastic idea. According to Global Firepower's 2018 survey, the US military is the most powerful military force on the planet. So you would think that he would be able to get things done. But he's been talking about this for 4 years, pretty much every day. And there's still no wall. And there's no sign of a wall being built. So maybe power is more complicated than just having lots of tanks. Okay. Let's look at the dictionary definition. This is what the dictionary says. It's the ability to do or act. It's the capability of doing or accomplishing something, which is just a dictionary way of saying getting shit done, getting people to do things. The thing about power is that it only works when there's somebody else in the equation. It doesn't work when there's only one of you. And there are degrees of power. And sometimes power is very, very one-sided. On the right, that's a Type 65 tank. It weighs 39 tons. It's got 2 machine guns and a big gun at the front. And on the left-hand side, there's a little guy with 2 shopping bags. That is about as unequal a power relationship as it's possible to imagine. Except look what the little guy with the shopping bags is actually doing. He's held up a line of tanks, and in about 5 minutes' time, if we run the video through, the shot pans back, and you realise there's not 3, there's about 60 all lined up. So maybe power is not as simple as it first appears. The good thing is that there are some frameworks. And we like frameworks because we're engineers, because they make things nice and simple and nice and linear and easy to work with. So I'm going to take you through a framework for 6 different types of power, so you have a better understanding of what you're dealing with, how it works, what people do with it, and how you can work around it. And because being nice all the time is really boring, we'll also talk a little bit about how to be evil with this. Because what fun is being nice all the time? You might see how other people can be evil. You might want to take it away and be evil yourselves. I'll leave that up to you. Okay, so let's go through the framework. First of all, we have coercive power. This is the simple one. It's the one that first comes to mind when people talk about power. It's the one that's ultimately enforced by threats of violence. Germany is a nice, quiet, relaxed, first world civilization. It's a nice liberal democracy. Everybody's nice to each other. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, blah, 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 blah. Eventually, if you step out of line, you're going to meet the guy on the right, and he's going to enforce his power on you by hitting you with his baton. That is coercive power. Now, fortunately, we don't meet this very often in the workplace. So what would you do if you are met with coercive power? Well, you're either in the wrong place, or you're working for the wrong person, and basically just get the hell out of there. But what can you do if you want coercive power? Let's assume that we're going to be evil. First of all, you've got to follow through in your threats. If in the May Day riots, the Polizei stood there with their batons and they waved them, but never actually hit anybody, eventually people would cotton onto that. They would realise that this is an empty threat and it would stop being a threat. So you have to follow through. You've also got to work within the rules. You don't want to break the rules so people can point at it and say, no, that's not right, you can't do that. By all means hit them, but only if you're allowed to hit them. And you should rule by fear. No point in being nice if you're going to hit people with a stick. Excuse me, that doesn't really work. However, bear in mind, the time limit, this is time limited. Eventually, the utility of your threats, your fear is time limited. Most dictators and tyrants ultimately fail. And as a rule of thumb, the nastier they were while they were a tyrant, the nastier their end is. So just be aware that it's not a free lunch. Okay, power number 2, legitimate power. This is based on position. I'm your boss, and therefore I get to give you orders. The chap on the right there with the silly hat, that is Generalinspekteur Eberhard Zorn. He is the chief of the Bundeswehr, so he's the head of the German Armed Forces. You can't really see it in the picture, but he's wearing there's lots of gold on his shoulders. He's got 4 stars and oak leaves. That shows that he is the general. And he has the legitimate power to launch missiles and send tanks into battle. How cool is that? You could say that he's literally got the power of life and death. Now, there are checks and balances. I don't think he's in a position to start an armed invasion of Baden-Württemberg just because he feels like it. He would presumably have to run it past Chancellor Merkel first, but nevertheless, he does have a lot of legitimate power. And you'll see this in organisations where there's a hierarchy. Might not be clearly as demarked as clearly as this with rank, but it's usually there. So, how can you work with it? Well, first thing you can do is you ask, can I work around it? Do I have to obey this person? Can I go and get what I need elsewhere? Is the legitimate power structure actually something I need? Can I choose how to comply? I might have been told to jump, but I might have some latitude in how high I jump, usually. And could I exploit another power to get around the legitimate power? And what we'll see in a couple of other ones is you can use other forms of power to work around legitimate power. Okay, so if we're going to abuse it, what do we need to do? Well, first of all, you need to give yourself a fancy title. Because let's face it, Vice President sounds a whole lot more impressive than Head of Engineering, doesn't it? Vice President of my department of 3. You should differentiate yourself with symbols. Get the corner office. Have a bigger screen. Wear a silly hat. And whatever you do, don't tolerate any dissent. If you do wear a silly hat, don't put up with people making fun of it, because then you will lose your legitimate power. Okay, type number 3. This is going to be familiar to any parents in the room. If you stop screaming and beating your fists against the floor in the middle of Kaufland, then I will buy you an ice cream. It's reward power. Reward power is based on what you have to give to somebody else. And this is a really interesting one. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on. The key to working around reward power is, first of all, is this something I actually want? Do I want an ice cream? Do I want a beer? Actually, I do. Is the reward something that you actually want? Because if you don't want it, then the power that other person has over you is reduced. Can you accept a substitute? Is there something else that you could use that you would prefer to have instead of the reward that's on offer? And can you get the reward elsewhere? Is this something that someone else can provide for you? If you want to abuse it, sorry, not abuse it, if you want to use it, you kind of use it with volume. Control scarce resources. Make sure that the reward that you have to give away is something that people can't get from anywhere else. So you control the ice cream fridge, or the beer fridge, Or you sign off people's vacation, because that's a reward as well. Make sure it's non-substitutable, that they can't use something else. So vacation is pretty non-substitutable. And make people second guess how to get it. Because if people don't know how to get it, it's just accentuating your power. That's reward power. This is where it gets really interesting. Referent power. Does anybody know who this is? No, I didn't think anybody would. This is a gentleman called Jim Jones. He was an American preacher, civil rights campaigner in the 1960s, and he founded a cult. He came into conflict with the US government, and he and his cult fled to Guyana. 1978, there was a congressional investigation. Basically, a team of people went to Guyana to investigate lots of reports about horrible things that were going on. There was a gunfight. Several US congressmen were killed, and 909 of his followers committed suicide by drinking poisoned Kool-Aid, which is incidentally where the phrase "drink the Kool-Aid" comes from. What's even more impressive, if impressive is the right word for it, 304 of those were children. So this man, through sheer force of personality, could get parents to kill their children. That's referent power. It's an extreme example, but there are other examples which we're more familiar with. This guy. Now, by all accounts, Steve Jobs was a pretty unpleasant individual. He was not a nice guy to work for, but he had a reality distortion zone. He had an ability to convince people that he was right and to back his vision when logic suggested that that wasn't the case. If you have referent power, you probably don't realize it. And if you realize you haven't got it, you're probably never going to get it. It's very hard to define, and it's also harder to fake. But how can you deal with it? Well, beware the reality distortion zone. Things might not be as they appear. Stay grounded in the facts and figures. Is there really a story behind this? And cross-check with your wider networks just to see if this is actually the reality that's being portrayed. But if you want to be powerfully referent or referently powerful, what can you do? Build your brand. Be an influencer. Be a Gary Vee or someone similar. Build your ego. There are no shy and retiring referently powerful people. And have some groupies. Because what's the point in having a cult if it's only you? So that was referent power. Resource power, now this will be familiar because resource power is really, really common in organizations. And the best way of illustrating reward power is with a little example from Pixar.
Late tonight on a skateboard. I really need the key before he was.
Well, it isn't that nice. But guess what? You didn't turn in your paperwork last night.
He didn't. I know.
This office is now closed.
That works a lot better when the Wi-Fi isn't shitty. Okay, resource power. Two things you can think about resource power. Are the resources substitutable? If someone is controlling, for example, the meeting rooms, can you use other spaces instead? Are there alternatives? Who really controls the resources that you need? And this is interesting because resource power is often inversely proportional to the position in the organization chart. If you think about the common resources that you need in your daily life, meeting rooms, beamers, travel, all those kind of things, they tend to be procured by people fairly low down in the food chain. So are you actually looking in the right place? And what can you do for them? Is there a quid pro quo that you can give if you want access to the meeting rooms? One of the most useful pieces of advice I was ever given in a job where I did a lot of traveling was the first time, when you come back from your first trip, go and take the team that do the bookings some chocolates. And I did that, and it was upgrades all the way after that, because they have the power. If you want to abuse it, well, hoard your resources. Obviously, don't give them away easily. Micromanage them. Make sure that there's lots of terms and conditions that people have to obey. And make the payoffs explicit. If you want something, what's in it for me? You want a meeting, it's going to cost you. And the sixth type of power is the one that we're all familiar with because we are all experts. This is the power that our industry is built on. Have you got someone in your team that you can't afford to lose because they're the only person that knows how this thing works? They have expert power. They know more than you do. And you've used your expert power in the past to get where you are today. How can you work with it? Well, prevent silos. Document the shit out of things, because if it's documented, it's out of somebody's head, it's no longer locked in their brains. And eliminate the single points of failure around the organisation. But what can you do if you want to abuse it? Hoard your knowledge. Be the expert. Be the only person that knows how this thing works. Never, ever document anything. Documentation is kryptonite to expert power. And build your ego. You know, be bold about what you know. I am the expert in this particular thing. So, 6 types of power. A couple of tools that you can use to figure out what you're dealing with. What kind of power am I dealing with here? Well, the first thing you can do is you can use those rough definitions and see if you can match the situation and the person to the power type. But there's also a very simple question you can ask, is simply, who can stop me? Because this will identify who has the power in this particular situation. Who can stop me doing it, whatever it is I want to do. Once you've done that, you can actually look at the network in your organizations, and if you plot people with their powers, you've come across some very, very interesting patterns. Power is very, very often distributed in ways that you wouldn't expect, particularly when we're talking about resource power and reward power. But there is another thing you can do, thanks to this chap. This is Tony Benn. He was a British politician of the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s. He had the unusual quality of getting steadily more left-wing as he got older. He died in 2014, but he got very, very exercised in his last 20 years or so about abuses of power. And he came up with the 5 tests of Tony Benn. And you can use this to diagnose what kind of power situation you're in. First of all, what power have you got? That you ask the person. Where did you get it from? In whose interests are you using it? Who are you accountable to? And then most importantly, how can we get rid of you? So, that was a framework for power. What about politics? Well, politics is practical power. Politics is power in action. No organisation will admit to being political. It's not something you say when you're interviewing people. So, could you tell me something about this organisation? Yeah, we're really political. Nobody says that. But every organisation is. As soon as you get 2 or more people in a room together, there are politics. And you can either deal with it, or you can pretend it doesn't exist. Getting things done, making people do things, remember that's what you do, that needs decisions. And decisions involve context. Decisions involve people. Decisions never get made by other sources. And there is a stereotypical process for decisions. You put information in one end, there's some process, and then there's an outcome. And that looks a bit like an algorithm, and that's the decision-making process that we'd like to think we'll use. What actually happens, it looks like this. Information goes in one side, there's a mess, some kind of process, and the decision drops out. And the gap between the ideal process and the actual process is politics. There are some preconditions for politics. You have to have scarce resources. You've got to have something to fight over, otherwise it makes no sense. The decisions tend to have to be complex and ambiguous. If they're very simple decisions that look more like algorithms, there's less scope for the political arguments. You need individuals who are willing to indulge in political behaviours, and you need a certain amount of tolerance in the organisation for the kind of behaviours that can be described as political. So, here are some design patterns for horrible internal politics. You get points if you spot your organisation here. You get bonus points if your organisation combines one or more of these, because that's perfectly possible to do. And because in Hollywood, nice guys don't have nearly as much fun as the evil guys, we'll just concentrate on the evil side of things from now on. How you can exploit these political situations to your own ends. So, I want to present to you the 7 types of highly dysfunctional organisation. We'll start with strict chain of command. Hierarchical organisation in practice. Everything is done by the book. You can't go around the chain of command. You talk to your boss, they talk to their boss, they talk to their boss, and eventually somebody makes a decision. Everybody is mildly paranoid that they might be out of the loop, because if they're out of the loop, they're irrelevant. Your secret weapon in the strict chain of command organisation is the BCC field on emails, because you can tell people what's going on without anybody knowing who's in the loop. Now, needless to say, synchronous communication tools like Slack, kryptonite to the skilled BCC user, don't do it. If you want to exploit strict chain of command, be a blocker, never refer something up which puts you in a bad light. And you can also subvert it by going downwards, because you can skip layers of the organisation. No one is ever going to question you because you're a boss. Strict chain of command, you can get away with lots of things. So, the next one, shoot the messenger. It's the bearer of bad news that gets punished. If you're the one telling the boss that the project isn't going to be delivered on time, you're going to be the one getting fired. The bearer of bad news is always the one that bears the burden. So, you need to figure out a way of getting the bad news across without it being you. Stay outside the blast radius, but be ready to jump in and pick up all the resources that the bearer of bad news left behind when they were fragged. Just careful that you don't pick up the radioactive blame debris. There is a definite life cycle of shoot the messenger organisations. When things go bad big, they go bad quickly. Barings Bank, Enron, Long-Term Capital Management, Lehman Brothers, Deutsche Bank, they are all shoot the messenger organisations. The next one, paranoid android. Yes, everybody really is out to get you. It's dog-eat-dog world. Don't dare turn your back on someone because they'll stab you in it. Sleep with one eye open, get somebody to taste your food, and remember that nice guys finish last. This is party politics. This is governmental politics in action. The A-team. The A-team is a pattern that you often see in organisations with a referent power structure, because it's all about who the boss likes, not about how well they perform. If you find people with titles like Senior Special Assistant Project Coordinator to the Vice President, or something ridiculous, chances are you're in an A-team situation. All the decisions are going to be made by a small group of people, so be part of that small group. Be careful about who you admit into the small group, but remember, you can trade favours for access to people on the outside. Decision by committee. No one is responsible for anything. Everything has to be discussed for at least an hour, preferably more. This is the waterfall version. There is, however, an agile version of this, which is known as decision by workshop. Works in exactly the same way. Everything runs at the speed of glaciers, and you're more likely to die of old age before anything gets done. First thing is just accept it. Shit's going to take forever. However, you can subvert this process with a couple of ways. First thing is, if the decisions are made in a committee, he who controls the agenda has the power. So make sure that nothing you ever want, if there's something you don't want to happen, never let it on the agenda. The second thing is that history is written by the victors, except in decision by committee. So even if the decision didn't go your way, if you're the person that writes the minutes, you can just make up any old shit. Data-driven. If the numbers don't add up, nothing gets done. Everybody will say that there's no politics in this organisation, but that's bullshit. And actually, all the manoeuvring takes place in spreadsheets. You can play data-driven offensively or defensively. If you're playing it offensively, just make shit up. Pad your figures, make questionable assumptions, play fast and loose with profit and loss. And remember, in any organisation, there are only 3 people who know how pivot tables work. So make sure that your material is as complicated as possible. The more sophisticated your model, the more convincing that you will be. You can also play it defensively. If you want to stop things happening, you just ask for more information. And you can play that for years. And then finally, we have straight from the guts. This is chaos. Things change at a moment's notice. Everything changes constantly. No one has a chance to catch up on anything. This is probably the best place to be Dr. Evil because you can get away with anything in here. Just go with it. Just do whatever you want to. So, those are the 7 types of highly dysfunctional organisations. Let's look at the creatures that inhabit the political zoo. These are the people you're going to be working with. Again, bonus points if you recognise anybody. Point them out if they're in the room. Double points if you work with several different types. So, first of all, we have the boss. These are the ones in charge. They are the ones that everybody is trying to get favour with. They don't play politics because they don't have to. They're in charge. There's a really simple way to play this one. Just be the boss. The second in command. Does anybody know who this is? One person. He's all that stands between Angela Merkel and a medical emergency. The second in command, possibly the most important person in the political landscape. You can lobby them directly, unlike the boss. And because they're the next in line, they're tremendously powerful. However, they are also most likely to be the evil politician in the organisation because they will have climbed over bodies to get where they are, and they're just waiting for the opportunity to put the knife in the back of the boss. Beware. The yes man always agrees with the boss, even if the boss is wrong, especially if the boss is wrong. They get where they were by making the boss look and feel good, so working with these people has to be viewed through the lens of how is this going to make the boss look. The miserable git. Nothing is ever good enough for these people because things aren't as good as they used to be. They're like a black hole for motivation and team morale, which makes them your secret weapon, because if you have a miserable git in your team, give them to somebody else and watch that team implode. The drama queen. The drama queen causes no end of disruption because everything is a dramatic crisis. It is constantly turned up to 11, and they are really exhausting to work with. But they have a redeeming feature. If you want to enjoy a good bitch about your co-workers, these guys are the queens of gossip. They're really good to go have a beer with. The empire builder just loves the idea of having power for the sake of power. If it's not nailed down, they will steal it. If anybody is going to rip off your idea and claim it as their own, it's this person. They are often completely ruthless in the acquisition of power. They won't stop until they're boss. So the trick with these people is to always count your fingers after you've shaken their hand. The peacemaker wants to be everybody's friend. Everybody needs to get on together and be happy. If there's an argument, they will be the ones trying to get people calmed down. They often have a huge amount of political power because they're perceived as having the best interests of the company at heart. But they're also really, really boring because they will refuse to gossip and never have a good word to say about anybody. So don't go for beers with those guys. The brain in a jar knows everything about everything, completely data-driven. They are usually the smartest person in the room, which is why successful politicians avoid the brain in a jar like the plague for fear of being made to look stupid. The parrots. The parrot will steal somebody else's ideas as their own. They don't tend to have an opinion of their own except whatever is the right opinion of the day. They can be useful. You can use them to gauge what will work if you think you've got an idea which might be a bit controversial. And they're also quite a good broadcast medium if you want to get your idea around the organisation if you don't mind it being stolen. And finally, we have the squeaky toy. They are really hard to pin down to anything specific. They always have a what-if question for anything you suggest. And they're called the squeaky toy because they make a lot of noise but never actually really say very much. So, to summarise, power is about getting people to do things. Power is situational. It depends on the interplay of the people in the circumstances. Power has got varied forms, and you can start to plot different types of power against different archetypes in the framework. It often appears where you least expect it. Don't just look at the loudest guy in the room. Politics is power in practice. It's the gap between rational decision making and the squishy, irrational human beings that we're forced to work with. Surviving politics is about adapting to the culture. What kind of culture am I in? How can I survive it? How can I adjust it to better my chances of success? And how do I deal with the characters that inhabit the political zoo? I hope some of that might be useful tomorrow when you go back to your office and call someone a squeaky toy. If all else fails, look at what this guy does.